Good morning. Happy Sabbath to you, and welcome to our final week in the book of Numbers, where we've been confronting carnality, challenging compromise, and calling kingdom citizens into dominion. You're tuned in to Kingdom Disciples Training Center. I am Dr. Lexi Johnson. This is our weekly Sabbath teaching. In other words, our Bible study hour. So, what we have been studying in the book of Numbers has not been about religious tradition. It has been about radical transformation. That's actually what we're about here at KDTC, right? We expose shallow faith, dismantle religious tradition, and raise up kingdom disciples who know their Bible, walk in power, and live what they preach, and they do so unapologetically. Today, we are dealing with what happens at the edge of the promise. Not everyone who makes it out of Egypt will walk into dominion. And so the question is, will you steward what God's given you, or will you die holding the promise but never possessing it? Right? What a tragic thing. What a tragic thing to have happen, right? That God has promised you some things, but you don't quite lay claim to that promise. You do not want to die at the border, right? So our main scripture for today is coming from Numbers chapter 33, verse 53. Numbers chapter 33, verse 53, and I may be bouncing back and forth between the New Living Translation and the New King James Version. Okay, all right. The NLT says, "Take possession of the land and settle in it, because I have given it to you to occupy." The New King James says, "You shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell in it, for I have given you the land to possess." Man, there is a lot to say, even just in that one scripture, right? And we will get to it as we go through today's teaching. So our focus today is Numbers chapter 31 through 36. Numbers chapter 31 through 36. All right. Okay, so let's get to it. In chapter number 31, what we see is the vengeance of Yah, right? There is a war with the Midianites. And verse 1 says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel. Afterward you shall be gathered to your people." All right, verse 3. "So Moses spoke to the people, saying, Arm some of yourselves for war, and let them go against the Midianites to take vengeance for the Lord on Midian. 1,000 from each tribe of all the tribes of Israel you shall send to the war." All right, so he began to give instructions on how to, organize so that they could go to war. The Lord had said, "Hey, go and, war with these people." He said, I've already made a way for you to win this war, and when you're done, there were also instructions, right, when they return from war, but we'll get to that in a minute. So first of all, who are the Midianites? Who are the Midianites? Well, the Midianites are actually also descendants of Abraham. They were descendants of one of his sons, and they were not the people, though, who were included as part of the promise. Okay, so a lot of times we hear about Isaac, we hear about Ishmael, but we don't often hear about any of the other children beyond Isaac and Ishmael. So we don't really talk about it that much, but we should, right? We should. So yes, they were descendants of Abraham through his wife Keturah. Okay, and they were never considered to be part of the covenant people of God. And so you can imagine, we're not going to dive into that today, but you can probably imagine some of the family dysfunction going on as a result of that, right? And so the Midianites were not at all kind to the Israelites. And so God was angry with them. And so now he was going to get his vengeance on the Midianites. And it reminds me of the Bible that tells us in a couple of places that vengeance is his, right? I can imagine some of the other Israelites were thinking, when is God going to deal with these people, right? They've been a thorn in our side. They do this to us. They talk, they blah, 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 whatever it is, right? But there is, we cannot exact vengeance in the most perfect way than our Father does, right? So this is why he says that vengeance is his. So what you see here in chapter 31 is him now saying, okay, it's time of commanding you to go against the Midianites. And this is, you're going to win, right? Because I am on your side. And so God commands Moses to avenge Israel against Midian. Israel then goes and Israel wipes out the men. But what do they do? What do they do? They spare the women. They spare the women. Okay. And so this was not the instruction of the Lord. It says, take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel. There was no exception, right? When you read through any of these verses, there wasn't any exception. There wasn't an exception made for women. There wasn't an exception made for children. There wasn't any exception. Okay. It says in verse 9, and the children of Israel took the women of Midian captive with their little ones, and took as spoil all their cattle, all their flocks, and all their goods. They also burned with fire all the cities where they dwelt and all their forts, and they took all the spoil and the booty of man and beast. Verse 12, then they brought the captives, the booty, and the spoil to Moses, to Eleazar the priest, and to the congregation of the children of Israel, to the camp in the plains of Moab by the Jordan, across from Jericho. And Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the congregation went to meet them outside the camp. Now, these men thought they probably had done a good thing, obviously, because they did it, right? I guess they thought that it was a good idea. God is, when he gives instructions, he's very clear. He doesn't need us adding to his instructions. He doesn't need us taking away from instructions. He's extremely clear on how he wants things to go. And so taking the women and children was not, as captives, was not part of the plan. And listen, Israel has a history. They have a history of mixing with ungodly women and then taking on and serving their gods, right? And so they just have not learned. Hard-headed, right? And before we get too judgmental of the Israelites, because we're the same, right? Many of us may not know if we descend directly from Abraham. But we do know that when we say yes to God, to be part of the kingdom of Yah, that we are adopted into the family. We are spiritual Israel, and we do the same things. We are just as hard-headed. We are just as hard-headed as they were. The only reason that we don't meet the same harsh consequences as they did, and their consequences oftentimes would be, immediate. The only reason that we don't meet very harsh consequences as they did, and believe me, we suffer our consequences. The only reason is because of Yahusha, right? Who paid the price for our sins. So there is grace and mercy for us, more grace and mercy than was extended to them before Christ, right? So we can't be, too judgmental and talk about them too badly, like, oh, they didn't get it. They're like as if we aren't the same, right? Many of us are the same. God gives us direction. He gives us guidance. He gives us instruction. And then we decide, okay, let me tweak the instructions a little bit and do it this way. This God is better. That's essentially what we're saying. Some of us may not outright say that out of our mouths, but in our behavior, that's what we'll do. Yeah, God, let me add this one thing to your instructions, right? Or let me take away this one thing. Or let me, put this twist or this spin on it. And God doesn't need that help. All right. So they meet Moses and Eleazar the priest. They meet them outside of the camp. And verse 14 says, and by the way, I'm reading from the New King James, says, but Moses was angry with the officers of the army, with the captains over thousands and captains over hundreds who had come from battle. And Moses said to them, have you kept all the women alive? Look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. So he's saying these women are not innocent. Like oftentimes in war, people say, okay, the women and the children, they're innocent. They don't have anything to do with this. So spare their lives. But Moses is saying in this case, no, these women they're not innocent. Okay. These women caused Israel to turn away from God, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. It was very intentional. And so he's like, they're not innocent, and they were not supposed to be kept alive. They were not supposed to be keeping them as captive. All right. So Moses then says, now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known a man intimately. Listen, because what they're doing is they are polluting the camp. They are polluting the camp. And I think it, talks more about this later on. And the importance of that. We have to be a set apart people, consecrated for the work of God. We cannot afford to be polluted by all the various different teachings and beliefs. Like there's people out there who now think it's popular to just mix a little of this with a little of this and a little bit of this, so I'm going to mix a little bit of the Bible with a little bit of, what Buddha says, and a little bit of this one, and a little bit of the ancestors and all this. And they, got this mishmash, and they think they're doing something. And I was like, no, okay, that's pollution. You're no longer pure, right? So the reason that every male among the little ones had to be killed, and every woman who has known a man, is because they had to get rid of the pollution. All right. Now he says, but keep alive for yourselves all the young girls who have not known a man intimately. And as for you, remain outside the camp 7 days. Whoever has killed any person and whoever has touched any slain, purify yourselves and your captives on the 3rd and on the 7th day. Now, the number 3 and the number 7 are very, very significant. We don't have time to deal with that today. I have dealt with it before in Bible studies before, but that it would be a very good opportunity for you to go and to dig into the numbers 3 and the number 7. Purify every garment, everything made of leather, every woven of goat's hair, and everything made. So they had to be purified, right? They had, they've been in war, they've been out killing, all of that kind of stuff. So they had to purify themselves as well. And now they were going to kill again because they brought these people back that they shouldn't have brought back. So all this purification had to take place. The purification laws are re-emphasized after this war, right? So what do we learn in chapter 31? We learn that obedience in warfare means following God's commands fully, okay? Not sentimentally, not partially, not, adding on or thinking that, you got a strategy or a plan that is better than God's, right? Because that's what we do when, God will say, hey, I want you to open the business. I want you to serve these people. I want you to do it in this way. This is your strategy for marketing, whatever the case may be. And then we'll be like, oh, but I took this class and let me add this, to the instructions that God has given me. As if man's knowledge is better than what God has to say. It's so crazy how we are, right? So partial obedience is still rebellion. You cannot and you can't show mercy to what God has marked for destruction. If God says to destroy it, you cannot show it mercy. Bottom line. All right, so let's go to chapter 32. I've got to kind of move a little bit swiftly here. So the Reubenites and the Gadites settle early. All right, so we have now a couple of tribes and a half a tribe, but two primarily, the Reubenites and the Gadites, who want to settle early. They want to settle on the east side of the Jordan, which is outside of the promised land. They come to Moses and they make their request to do so, right? And Moses is like, what? Why do you want to do that, right? And does that mean now that you don't actually want to go and fight with your brothers? So the rest of the tribes, that you don't want to go and fight with your brothers to make sure that they get the promised land. He's like, no, that can't happen. So he makes a concession, and he says that the only way that they can settle in the land outside of the Jordan, east of the Jordan, is that they must agree to help fight. Okay, so they can set up shop, they can leave their women and children there, but they must go and fight. They must go and fight and help their brothers. If they do not go help them fight and to get the promised land, then they cannot have that land that they're asking for, which is just on the east side of the Jordan. Now, there are some that argue like, oh, this was very, a strategic thing that was done because it was allowed, right? So they say, okay, then this was very strategic. There was nothing strategic about it. These people saw, the people of Reuben and the people of these people saw that, oh, this land looks really good right here. It's plush, it's whatever. It just looks like the best to them, right? And so they decided, we want this. We don't want what God is offering. This is what we want right here. We think this is better. Once again, that sounds like us today. God says, this is what I have for you. And we're like, I like this better over here. And I like this better over here. And because I really don't know what I'm getting over there, and I really don't want to go through the trouble of doing what needs to be done, I'm going to settle right here. Listen, settling before crossing over into your promised land can become a generational stronghold, as it did for them in many ways, right? once again, we think we know better. It's like, how do we tell God? God's saying, this is the promised land. They were actually repeating what their ancestors had done. Because remember, when Joshua and Caleb were younger, it was them two and 8 others that went to spy on Canaan land. And they came back and it was like, wow, it's amazing. The grapes are as big as your head. They didn't say that, but the grapes were really huge. And so they were like, oh, it just looks great over there. But there's these giants, there's these Philistines. And so, we should just probably not bother. We should probably just kind of, leave it alone. find another place. Though God had promised that place to them. So remember what God said, that them people, they were not even going to see the promised land because they didn't believe. So here we are now, another generation. Okay? The Reubenites and the Gadites now. They're saying, hey, you know what? We like this better. Settling before crossing can become a generational stronghold. And that's exactly what happened, right? And so when God gives us instructions and he says, your land is over here, over there, wherever it is, that's where your land is, right? But oftentimes what we do is we settle somewhere because this is comfortable. We like it here. It feels good. All of that, right? But just because it's comfortable doesn't mean that it's covenant. And so you have to decide, what do you want? Do you want comfortable or do you want covenant? Which one do you want? Right? Comfortable or covenant? And I don't know about you, but as I was studying this, I'm like, I'm thinking about my life. I'm thinking about what has occurred and what is occurring. And I'm like, yeah, I have settled in some areas of my life, right? And I needed to make a decision, which I did. Like, I am not going to settle anymore. And so I'm going to, no matter if it's uncomfortable or whatever it is, I need to push through so I can get what God has promised for me. Listen, God has promised you some things too, but just because he promises it doesn't mean that it's just going to automatically fall in our lap. No, he has given us gifts and talents and abilities and things to go out and to get what we need to get. It's like, yeah, I got this for you, but it's here. And you have to take this journey to get here. And so many of us along the journey are like, you know what? I like this here. I'm going to stay right here. They were talking about how all this is going to be good for my livestock and blah, blah, blah. You can have livestock and still lack legacy. That livestock means nothing. I don't care if you're like, you know what? I don't need to keep going where God told me to, because right here, I'm making the money I want. I have, the family I want. I have blah, blah, blah. You can have all those things, but it means nothing if you settle short of the promise. If you settle short of the promise, you still lack legacy. You are still creating generational strongholds to ripple throughout the rest of generations, right? Until there's one generation that rises up and says, nah, this is not where we're supposed to be. But why put that on the next generation, right? So, yeah, that was chapter 32. Now, chapter 33, the wilderness journey is reviewed, and most people will look at this chapter, they probably will skip over it because it details every stop on the journey and the names of these various different places, right? So it starts out, These are the journeys of the children of Israel who went out of the land of Egypt by their armies under the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now Moses wrote down their starting points of their journeys at the command of the Lord, and these are their journeys according to their starting points. So they departed from Ramses in the first month. And so the chapter goes on and it talks about where they departed from, where they went to, when they departed, where they went to, how long they stayed in that place, when they left that place, got to the next place, when they got to the next place. Like, it's a very detailed record of every stop from Egypt to the plains of Moab. Right? And it's beautiful. People will read this chapter and be like, let me skip over this because there's nothing going on here. That's what we do in life, right? We're like, we don't give any respect to the stops along the way. We just want to get to the place. We want to hear the beginning and we want to hear what at the end. We don't care about the middle, but it is in the middle. It is in the process, right? Where the transformation happens. Not when you get to the end of the thing. It's in the process where all the good stuff happens, right? And so don't skip that part. This is why you hear the phrase like, hey, enjoy the journey. Enjoy the journey. Don't be in such a rush to get to the place before it is your time to get to the place. Enjoy the journey. Enjoy the journey, okay? Because the journey is part of the whole experience. The journeys, if you ask me, the journey oftentimes is the best part of it. Not necessarily the start point and not necessarily the end point, right? The stories, the testimonies, and all of that come from the journey. That's what makes getting to the promised land so good, is the journey, right? So there is a, review of the journey. Okay. And again, during this journey, God commands them to drive out all inhabitants when they enter the land. And every stop that we make, we are supposed to drive out all inhabitants. I don't think we understand. That's why I'm saying the journey is the most beautiful part, because every stop along the way, you are supposed to drive out the enemy and take up territory for the kingdom. We are supposed to advance the kingdom. It's supposed to grow in people, grow in land, grow in every resource. But too many of us are so busy just trying to get to the end. We don't even care about the people during that time, the whatever, or we're at a stop and we're like, oh, I don't want to be here. I don't like it here. Blah, blah, blah. All the complaining and the murmuring and the whatever. And we are really missing out on taking up territory for the land. Listen, it is not your history, whether you belong to this family, that family, you come from a line of pastors or this or that or whatever. It's not your history, a line of business owners or this. It's not your history that entitles you to dominion. No, it's your obedience that does. Who cares if you come from a line of pastors? Who cares if you come from a line of entrepreneurs? Who cares if you come from a line of teachers or a line of whatever? It matters not. Your obedience is what matters. And that's why the journey is important. Every compromise that you leave in the land will become a thorn in your side. And that's what they learned. Verse 55, it says, but if you do not, verse 55 of chapter 33, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. Moreover, it shall be that I will do to you as I thought to do to them. So you could get to the promised land, but if you were not obedient along the way, you're going to end up just like people who are not in covenant. Because you're not in covenant. You sidestepped. You're outside of it. And that's the shame, right? Okay, so let's keep moving. Chapter 34. In chapter 34, what we have is the boundaries being set. So God defines the geographical borders of Canaan. And again, some people will look at this and this is boring stuff, but there's meat in all of this. So God defines the geographical land of Canaan. The leaders are appointed to divide the land, okay? And here's the thing. God defines your portion. This is what we need to get out of chapter 34, that he defines your portion. You don't get to choose the lines, okay? Not when you have said, yes, Lord, I am, I give myself to you. All right? Nothing is ours. We don't get to choose the lines. He sets them. He sets them. So he makes those lines, and then he tells us to operate within those lines, staying in your lane, not trying to be a worship singer when you have been called to be a teacher, not trying to go and, open some kind of business he didn't call you to open, but he told you to open this business over here. Right? But because you think you belong over there, right? So God is the one who defines your portion. You don't get to choose that. I don't get to choose the boundaries. He sets all of that. Okay? So when we disrespect divine boundaries, that leads to delayed breakthrough. I need to say that again, right? Because I'm telling you, that's something that ouched me too, right? When you disrespect the divine boundaries, when you are out of line, that leads to delayed breakthrough. God gives dominion with definition. If it has no order, then it's not from him. If there is no order, no boundaries, then it's not from him. And there's a lot of talk about boundaries today, boundaries in relationships and all of that. And yeah, if it don't have no order, then it's not from him. If there are no boundaries, there is chaos. All right. Chapter 35. Chapter 35 now talks about, the Levites and what is going to be their portion. Remember, the Levites will not have their own land. They serve full time. They serve the Lord full time. Okay. So 48 cities are given to the Levites, including 6 cities of refuge. And these cities of refuge are for accidental killers, people who've accidentally killed somebody and now they are running from, the family that wants of their loved one that they murdered, and they are trying to seek, they want them dead. So they could come to one of these cities for refuge, right? And then at some point it would be decided whether or not it was truly an accident or not. And then there would be justice if they were found to actually have murdered someone intentionally, right? And it goes through and talks about, what qualifies as a murder that's intentional, okay, versus accidental. So the justice laws for murder and blood vengeance are laid out. Now, the cities of refuge, man, they were symbolic of what Yahushua would come to do as our high priest, right? And he is our refuge. So the cities of refuge were very prophetic. And I also said, man, this is so beautiful. If we would just today in 2025, set things up the way God set things up. Follow that order. We had cities of refuge, right? Even cities of, and the cities of refuge weren't just for murderers, but if people had needs, if there were foreigners that were displaced, they could stay in cities of refuge. If we would just do this in the way that God set things out, we wouldn't have all the chaos we got going on all over the world right now, right? So the Levites didn't get land, but they did get spiritual responsibility. And the responsibility was huge. It was no walk in the park, okay? It was huge. They could literally lose their life for not, remaining consecrated and, really doing the things of the Lord. So there's a difference between refuge and escape, and only the repentant qualify for refuge. You hear me? Only the repentant qualify for refuge. So what does it mean to repent? It means not only to say you're sorry, but your actions also indicate that you're no longer going in the way of destruction, but now you're going in the way of life, right? So, yeah, refuge wasn't for just anyone. It was for those who were repentant, okay? And ministry, the other thing that we should know out of chapter 35 is that ministry without territory means that your inheritance is in your obedience, not your stuff. Okay, because the Levites didn't have stuff, but they still had they still are part of the inheritance. So it's not about your stuff. It's about your obedience. All right, and then finally in chapter 36, we have the inheritance secured by boundaries. And it talks about the daughters of Zelophehad. And we talked about them last time, right? And how now they allow for this change in man's rules about women being able to inherit land. So now that they were able to inherit land, now they were going back and they were reviewing this because people were now saying, hey, if these women, they inherit land and now they go marry people outside of their own tribe. Okay. So they marry to other tribes, not outside of Israel. They weren't talking about that. They were just talking about marry outside of their tribe. That if they did that, then the tribes would be losing land, right? So the daughters of Zelophehad are told to marry within their tribe, and it was not only for them, but any woman. So they were, in order to keep their inheritance, if they married outside of their tribe, that land would stay with the tribe. They would have to go without the land, right? So they are told to marry within their tribe to keep the inheritance intact. And that's what the daughters of Zelophehad did. They ended up marrying some cousins in the tribe. I would imagine they were distant cousins, but I don't know. Doesn't say that, just as they married cousins, right? So anyway, the book ends with divine order to secure a generational legacy. How powerful, right? So inheritance is not just received, right? You don't receive it, but you also have to protect it. You have to protect it. And that's what chapter 36 gave us a picture of, that you have to protect the generational legacy. And so your decisions about partnership, who you partner with, who you align with, who you marry, all of those decisions, who you partner with, these affect your legacy. And we make these decisions not even thinking about this stuff, right? It affects your legacy. So don't compromise dominion for some emotional or other convenience, okay? So what do we learn in Numbers 31 to 36? That obedience after victory is just as important as obedience before battle. Got to be obedient all the way through, before, during, after. That we don't settle on the edge of dominion. We got to cross over, okay? So the Reubenites and the Gadites, they're on the edge and they want to settle. Your history matters, but your consistency and your obedience determines your future. We also learn that God doesn't bless chaos. Boundaries are his protection. We also learn that spiritual responsibility outweighs material acquisition all the time, right? And legacy is protected by discipline, not just desire. Because we can be desirous of a lot of things, but sometimes our desires can take us places that we never imagined, right? And so we have to protect our legacy through discipline and obedience, all right? So, practical application here. Identify areas where you have settled early. Where have you stopped short of what God promised? Identify those areas, write them down, repent, and then get up and begin moving again. Reevaluate your boundaries. Are you maintaining the divine borders, right? Are you maintaining the divine borders that the Almighty Yah assigned to your time, to your relationships, to your finances, to your focus, right? And then take inventory of what needs to be driven out. What enemy are you tolerating that God told you to get rid of? It could be things, people, places, whatever. What did he tell you to get rid of? And you're still giving grace to that thing, right? And then finally, reinforce your family legacy. Are your decisions preserving or perverting your inheritance? Oh, mercy. These are some things I really, truly wish I understood in my early days, but it's all right. I'm understanding them now and moving forward. So that is our study on the book of Numbers. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. I have been so blessed by this study of the book of Numbers. And if you haven't seen the first 3 parts of this, I would encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, Kingdom Disciples Training Center, and check out the previous studies. And then I would encourage you to actually just do a deep dive of every chapter in Numbers if you can. And it's so beautiful. It really is, and so relevant to our lives today. So anyway, that's all that we have for you today. Any relevant information that you need to know or that I would like to share with you, you can find in the description or in the show notes, depending upon where you're watching this. Listen, God bless you. You have an amazing rest of your Sabbath.